seen that in our applications thus far, the foundation is a class called main activity. And an activity has a life cycle as the app is running. And it's important that we understand that life cycle and we can code to the various states of that life cycle to allow our app to handle data better and to persist that data as the life cycle goes through the various states. When we launch an app, the class calls its onCreate function, and we override that in our code. And we've been doing that thus far. In fact, by default, we get a overridden onCreate method as part of our main activity class. And we pass that on to the parent through the super command. But it's also where we have been specifying the layout that we want to use as we start up our application. And that layout is an XML file. We perform some other initialization routines in that onCreate method. We've taken our views and created references to those views that we then use in code. And we can do things as far as loading in databases, other data that our application is going to require as it runs. When the onCreate method is called, the app is not yet visible on our screen. After onCreate, the onStart method is called. Now it may or may not exist in our code, but it goes to that start state, very quickly goes to the resume state, and we can handle an onResume method. Through that process, you may be needing to restore instance states of saved data. But once it goes through that onResume, the app is then active. And that's what we think of starting an app. To date, we have primarily only coded the onCreate and ignored the onStart and onResume. And so everything we need to do is in onCreate, and our app is active. And our app remains active until it's interrupted, maybe by a phone call, or we navigate to another activity, or we go back to the home screen. And in that case, the app goes into a paused state, and we can call the onPause method, which we would override from the activity class. And then it goes into the background stack with the stopped state. And we can, again, override the onStop method in our activity class. Now it also calls at that point an onSaveInstantState method if it exists, in which we might want to store some data in case the app does not persist, or if it does persist, of restoring that data to the screen. Now there's one of two things that can happen here. If it remains in the background state and the operating system needs that memory space, it will destroy the app. So it kills the app and it goes into the final onDestroy method before it is removed. The user itself might choose to kill the app, but there's a couple of gotchas here. One is if we rotate our device from portrait to landscape or landscape to portrait, the activity goes through the onDestroy state and then is recreated, calling the onCreate method again. And so if you have two different layouts for portrait and landscape, you may notice that any data you're working on in one view is lost when you go to the other view. There are ways we can get around that, and we'll discuss that later in this video. We can also go from one activity to another activity, and oftentimes we click the back button up on the navigation bar and it calls a finish method to go back to the previous activity, but in that process the previous activity is destroyed and then recreated with the onCreate bundle again. So those are two areas where we want to be doing some programming to make sure that our data persist when we rotate the screen or when we go from one activity to another activity. Now there's another option besides destroying the app, and that is the app can be restarted. And so there's an onRestart method before it goes to the onStart and onResume. This might be an instance where we click the home button, and so our application has gone into the stop state, and then we reinitiate or go back to that app. It hasn't been killed, and so we'll go to the onRestart, start, resume, and then our app is active again. But we need to realize that any initialization that was taking place in the onCreate is not being done again, although everything in onCreate should be geared towards that initialization and not towards ongoing processes. So that is the life cycle of an activity. Now I've created the ubiquitous Lifecycle demo application, and we can see how the app goes through these various states as we interact with it. So let me jump over to Android Studio and show you that. So here's my version of the ubiquitous Activity Lifecycle demo app. And what I did is I just took the Hello World text view, named it TV Hello. And I've got some buttons that change the text to ASU or to SMCC that we can see how this data is saved or not saved as we go through these various cycles. I had read somewhere that when you issue a dialog or an alert, it goes into an on-paused, on-stop state, and then when that dialog alert is completed, it goes back to the onRestart. And so I wanted to test that. And actually what I found in the testing was that's really not true. The app simply remains active in the active state. But this is a good way to test things to see if what you read is true. Things sometimes change in the Android world. And that's what these three buttons are for. And I'll demonstrate those as well. So let's take a look at the activity code. So I have some variables here for correct answer and QNum. That's actually tied into one of the dialogues. Here's my variable TV hello, which is a text view. I'm doing a late initialization, and then the onCreate, finding that view by ID and referencing TV hello. So what I've done here in onCreate is I've added a log statement with the tag lifecycle and just say that I've called the onCreate method and passed it bundle. And then I added overriding functions for the other state methods, such as onStart. And all I did here is pass it on to the parent, so super, and then again did a log of info with the tag lifecycle and say I called onStart, onResume, onPause, onStop, onRestart, onDestroy. So I hit all those different states of the lifecycle. And then I also included the onSave instant state method overridden, as well as the onRestore instant state method. I'm not doing anything other than showing that these have been called. Now I have some other test functions here. This is the buttons for showing SMCC and ASU. And then I have my alert button. I did a dialog fragment testing that, and then ended up replacing that with a dialog using an XML layout. And then I want to demonstrate going to another activity. So what happens when we suspend this activity and go to a second activity? So I have a go activity 2. And I also created a second class called activity 2, which is what this is going to call, and a layout for that as well. So that's my activity lifecycle demo. Let's run this and watch the various states that the app goes through in response to things we might do as the user. Now you may have noticed we got the onCreate, onStart, and onResume methods called as our app came into view. I'm going to shrink this a little bit because I do want to rotate this at some point. I'm going to take my logcat and let's just view it as a floating window. So we can watch the various lifecycle states as we go through the program. So I mentioned that if we rotate our device, notice it went through the onPause, onStop, the onSave instant state, and then it destroyed our activity and then recreated it with the onCreate, onStart, and it called the onRestore instant state method and then onResume. So this was the first running of our activity in portrait mode, and then this is in the landscape mode. Come back here. I'm going to click the ASU button. So we get ASU here, and then I'm going to rotate it again. Tell the emulator to rotate it. And notice that now it's gone back to the portrait view. It again destroyed our activity and created a new one, but we lost that information of ASU in this text view and back to the default hello world because that's what was defined in our layout. So what we want to do down the road is look at how do we save the data that's in this text view so that if we rotate it, it retains that information or restores that information rather than losing it. We can do that in several ways. using an external file, using shared preferences, using JSON, using a text file, even an online database. Okay, let me rotate back here again. Okay, so I've cleared the log cap by clicking the trash can button in the upper left-hand corner. As I said, I'd read that alerts and dialogues caused lifecycle events to occur. And so I created a simple alert. And in that I have a logging that I've called the alert. And then also when I click OK, it says that basically the alert dialogue is finished, or the submit button's been pressed. Did the same thing with a dialog layout where I'm using another XML file. And we get the same thing, that it's showing that the XML layout dialog started and ended. But there's no lifecycle events happening here. We don't see the onPause, the onStop, the onResume happening. So just be aware of that you don't have to worry about capturing your data when you're showing an alert. But let's look at what happens when we go to an activity. So I'm going to switch to a second activity that I've called Activity 2. And when I did that, it called the onPause, or went into the onPause state for Activity 1. Then it called the onCreate, onStart, and onResume for Activity 2. And you see that those happened in the matter of just probably less than a second. And then it calls the onStop for Activity 1. So Activity 1 is basically replaced visually with Activity 2 for a split second there before it actually goes into the stop state. And then it calls the onSave instance state for if any data we might want to preserve. Now when I go back to Activity 1, notice that it pauses Activity 2, and then it destroys Activity 1 and recreates it just as if we had rotated the screen. So something to be aware of: if you have data, you want to make sure you restore that data at some point. It didn't call the onRestore save instance state event. So we want to make sure we call that. But then the Activity 2, it called onStop, and then it destroyed Activity 2. Let's look at one other thing, and that's what happens when we navigate to another app that might already be running or go to the home screen. So I'm going to click the home screen. You notice we went into the onPause, onStop, and onSave instance state by doing that. And then if I run another app, nothing is happening to my project. Nothing's happening to my app, which is in the background. No change, no states are changing there. I'm going to go back to the home. Let's come back to our activity lifecycle. So we got an onRestart, onStart, onResume. Now I'm going to do one more thing here. Let's change our data. Let's go back to home and then come back to our project. And my data is still there because it didn't destroy the lifecycle. Now it could have, the operating system could have destroyed it if it needed the memory. So we're running this app, and then we run a bunch of other apps, and our device needs that memory space. It could destroy it. So it didn't happen here, but it could have by the operating system. Just something to be aware of. That's a quick demo of the activity lifecycle in Android. In the next video, we'll look at how do we persist the data when transitioning from a destroyed state back to a onCreate state. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Android App Development Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.